I've tested 14 different variable ND filters, ranging from $25 all the way up to $400. And although some of the most expensive filters had the best performance, some of the cheapest filters were actually surprisingly close, so you don't have to spend an outrageous amount of money just to get a high quality filter. I've done all the tests: color cast, sharpness, vignette, cross pattern, as well as the functional aspects and ergonomics of the filters. I'm also going to cover what a variable ND filter is, how it differs from a standard ND filter, and whether you really need one or not. So if you're an advanced user, already know all about ND filters, you can just jump to the testing portion of the video, and I've chapter marked everything below so you can find what you need. I've also linked all the specific filters, and I have some notes in the description about the different filters, like a little bit of a cheat sheet. Many of these manufacturers make filters that look almost identical, so I put links to the specific filters that I've covered in this video in the description down below. I think for new photographers, one of the first things you have to answer is, what does an ND filter do, and do you really need one? Well, ND filters are effectively sunglasses for your camera. And their main purpose is to allow you to use a slower shutter speed, whether that be in video or photo. It just decreases the amount of light hitting the sensor, and that allows you to use a lower shutter speed. And in video, we do this because of what is called the 180 rule. And this is to achieve natural motion blur. This involves setting your shutter speed to double what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 24 or 25 frames per second, you should be setting your shutter speed to 1/48 or 1/50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you should be shooting at 1/60 for a shutter speed. Now, most consumer level cameras shoot 24 frames per second, but don't have a 1/48 shutter speed. That's fine. In those cases, you would shoot 1/50. And the reason that we are trying to do this, and the reason we need the ND filter to achieve this, is if you imagine you're shooting a specific scene, and for that scene you want to use an f2.8 aperture, and you want to use your 1/50 shutter speed, and you maybe have your ISO as low as you can go. You might be in a situation, and in fact, if there's decent lighting, you're almost certainly in a situation where your image is going to be overexposed. And we can't go any lower with our ISO value. We have already set our shutter speed to what is the standard cinematic look, and we're using an aperture that we think is right for the scene. f2.8 is giving us the right amount of detail in focus and out of focus. And this is the creative decision that we have made. And the only way to now decrease the light coming in and hitting the sensor and achieve proper exposure is to use an ND filter. Now, if we didn't have the ND filter, we'd have two choices. We could either close the aperture down, which would actually make a deeper depth of field and more in focus, but this would completely change the look of our image. Or we could increase the shutter speed, which then we wouldn't have this idea of cinematic motion blur or the 180 rule. And that means that the images that we're seeing, rather than having a natural blurring when things are moving, you will get this judder effect that looks a bit more like something you'd see from a GoPro or a smartphone. Now, it isn't just video shooters that would want to use an ND filter, and there's a couple reasons in photography that you would want to use an ND filter. And the first one is if you're using what's called a very, very fast lens. In some camera systems, you can't go over a certain shutter speed, and 1/4000 is a pretty common maximum shutter speed for a lot of consumer level cameras. And if you have one of these lenses that shoots at f1.2 or f1.4 or even f1.8 in a very bright scene, you open that up because you want to get that blurry background, and that lets too much light in. Your ISO is as low as it can go already, and then your shutter speed is maxed out at 4000 and your image is still overexposed. In that situation, the only way to get a proper exposure for that image is to decrease the light coming in and hitting the sensor, and in that case, we would use an ND filter. So that is one situation that a photographer would want to be using an ND filter. The next one is for long exposure motion blur in photos. So just like the video, we're trying to get this natural cinematic motion blur. Sometimes we want to do photos where we blur the motion. And generally, this is getting a very, very long shutter speed. Now, this could be a half a second or 2 seconds or even up to 10, 15, 30 seconds. And this does a couple things for us. If we're shooting a landscape scene, we could do this, and this could blur the clouds and create this moving cloud motion in the scene. If we are shooting an ocean or water, this will smooth out the water and get this really interesting, ethereal, beautiful look. You commonly see this in long exposure seascapes. The other place you might use it is for like in a city at night where you want to get those streaking headlights, that long exposure streaking headlights. And another might be in a busy city where you've got people moving around and you want to take an exposure that actually demonstrates people moving from one place to another. So maybe you've got some historic building and all these people are whizzing back and forth. And instead of them all being frozen in place, you can use a longer exposure and you'll have this beautiful building, and then you'll have this kind of ghostly outline of these people moving. And the longer the exposure is, the more that's blurred, but it gives this sense of motion even in a photo like that. When you look into ND filters, you're going to find there's two different kinds. There's variable ND filters and there's fixed ND filters. Now, a fixed ND filter is just like a piece of glass from sunglasses. And with that, you just choose the darkness you want, how much light you want to decrease coming in and hitting the sensor, and you pick that specific filter. So it might be a half-stop filter, a one-stop filter, two-stop filter, and this just tells you how much it is decreasing the light coming into hitting your sensor. Once you put that on, that's it. It's not variable. You can't change it. If you want to decrease the light by more, you have to put on a different filter. This will result in buying a number of different filters. It also means even if you have all the filters you need and you want to shoot a scene and you want to decrease the light, you can't change it except for by taking the one filter off and putting another filter on. This means this is going to be a very slow process, particularly if you're vlogging or running around shooting video. Now, if you look at high-end movie production, they almost always used fixed ND filters like that. And the reason they do that is because those filters tend to have a higher level of color accuracy. You don't have any issues with cross pattern or vignette, which are issues that we will see when we talk about the variable ND filters. And they will also, in general, give you the highest quality image, but you lose the convenience of being able to quickly decrease the light coming into your lens. And because of that, most of the people you see on YouTube, most vloggers, most people are just running gun filmmakers using standard consumer level equipment. These people are going to be using variable ND filters. Variable ND filters do work a little bit differently than fixed ND filters. Variable ND filters actually are two polarizing filters crossing over each other. And a polarizing filter is generally used to take a reflection of light off. Maybe you're taking a picture of a car and there's reflections on it, which just doesn't make the car stand out. Or maybe you're shooting into some water and you're getting glare off the water, but you kind of want to see into the water and see the depth of that water. Also, when you're shooting a sky, if you want to get a more true blue sky, you can use a polarizing filter. So that is what a polarizing filter is for. And the way that works is it blocks the waves coming at certain angles into the lens, which is giving you that glare. So a polarizing filter you put on, and it generally won't significantly change the darkness of your image, but when you turn it, it will block the light coming from different angles. And that way light that happens to be bouncing off the water and into the lens can be turned until that's cut out. Now, the way a variable ND filter works is it takes two of these polarizing filters, puts them over top of each other, and as you turn them together, they work together to block more and more light. This clearly has the advantage of allowing you to put one filter on your lens and use it for a variety of different situations. And when you want to decrease the light, you just turn the filter. You don't have to put a whole new filter on. But it does have a couple of side effects. The first one is you still get that circular polarizing filter effect, which means that you will be blocking reflections or light coming from certain angles, even though it's not really part of the design of the filter or what it's for. And this can affect your image in a way that may be desirable or undesirable. But when you've got a standard filter on, you're actually changing polarization as well as decreasing the light that's coming in. The other thing that can happen is when the filters get to a certain position, you can get a cross pattern in your image, or you can get two very dark corners or heavy vignette. This is something you're not going to get with a fixed ND filter. Ultimately, when we are comparing a fixed ND filter to a variable ND filter, we're comparing convenience to performance. You're going to get the best performance out of fixed ND filter, but that is not going to give you much convenience because you're going to have to constantly change filters when you have different lighting conditions or even when you change the aperture of your lens. With a variable ND filter, it's just a twist. It's much more convenient. Vignette. And that's why, for the purposes of this video and what you see on YouTube, this is the commonly used filter system, is a variable ND filter. First, we're going to look at the color cast performance of these filters. Now, even though there's filters out there that say true color and they have absolutely don't change the colors at all, that's not true. Even the best filters change the color a very tiny bit. And I've covered that in this video, and the tests have actually demonstrated that. But the different filters do have different levels of color shift. Now, I'll throw some of the images up on screen now, but I'll tell you the top 3 performers as far as the color shift goes. Now, the first one was the Freewell Matte Box. This one was shockingly good. It only had a 50 Kelvin shift and a +5 tint. I was really impressed by that. Interestingly, the 1 to 5 was, I think, 50K under, and the 6 to 9 stop, it's a 2-filter system, was 50 Kelvin over. The next was the Neewer True Pro Nano system, the 1 to 5 stop. That had a 100 Kelvin shift, and it had a -1 tint. So that is a very, very little shift and almost no tint change at all. And then there was the Neewer Nano range, 1 to 5 stop, which also had a 100 Kelvin shift and a -1 shift in tint. Now, this is interesting because that is one of the cheapest in the lineup, and the performance was almost identical to the one of the most expensive in the lineup. And as we get to the conclusions, this is going to allow us to identify that there are some cheaper filters that we can use that will get us like near the top of the range as far as results go. There are some trade-offs, but I'll go through that in the summarization. The other one is the JJC True Color 1 to 10 stop filter. That had a 175 Kelvin shift and a +1 tint. Also, the 7 Artisans, the Freewell K2 were also pretty good. The worst in the lineup were the K&F Nano K and the H&Y Revel Ring. The K&F Nano K had a 575 Kelvin shift, and the H&Y Revel Ring had a 350 Kelvin shift and a +8 tint. The next thing I'm going to look at is the X pattern or vignette performance. And this is an issue where you either get an X across your entire image or you get dark corners creeping in, which can make the image potentially even unusable. Now, what we need to know is the wider angle lens, the more it is prone to get this. So we might have a situation where we have a filter that we've stopped down to 5 stops and we're shooting at 15 millimeters on a full frame camera or 10 millimeters on a crop sensor camera. And we have an image where we have really poor vignette performance. But if you zoom in to say 24 millimeters, it's completely gone. So what we have to understand is we're not just evaluating each of these filters, we're evaluating them at different focal lengths. The other thing you'll find, regardless of the focal length, it's also dependent on how much light you're choosing to block in the image. So we might be at a 15 millimeter focal length, and at 1 stop, that filter is absolutely fine. But if we try to use that filter maxed out at 5 stops on 15 millimeters, it's unusable. And what we'll see as we go through this, for the most part, most of these filters, or all filters in general, if you're shooting 15 millimeters and you try to go all the way to 5 stops, you're actually going to find that the image gets quite messy and is generally unusable. And although I've tested this performance on all of the different filter systems, I'm only throwing on screen 7 different filters to demonstrate, just to kind of keep things a bit more concise and easier for you to see. They're also fall into the filters that I'm going to recommend later in the video. And if we look at this image, we got 15 millimeter at the minimum MD, 1 or 2 stops, because one of the lenses or one of the filters starts at 2 stops. And we need to compare the bare lens image to the other images. And if you look across all these, I think these are all quite usable. I think if I were to look at them, I'd say the 7 Artisans, JJC True Color, and Neewer Pro, maybe they're the best. But for the most part, there's no meaningful difference, and I think they're all fine. Notice the bare lens image does have some vignette already, so definitely compare that to work out what you're seeing. Next, we're going to look at the 15 millimeter focal length too, and we're really focusing on 15 millimeters here because that is where things are going to be most affected. As we zoom in and we go through these comparisons, you'll see that the filters can be used at a higher and higher amount of stops. Once again, we're comparing the bare lens and looking through these. 7 Artisans looks good, JJC True Color looks good, Neewer Pro looks good. I think you see the 2 Neewer are starting to look a little bit messy, and maybe the Freewell is picking up a little bit of a vignette there as well. But I think honestly, at 3 stops and 15 millimeters, these are all usable. Keep in mind, if you're shooting a blank wall, it's really going to show this off. But if you're shooting a real world situation, you're much less likely to notice anything. And stopping down to 15 millimeters and 5 stops, which is the maximum of most of these filters, we look at the 7 Artisans. That's probably the best one, but you look at those corners are pretty messy. Go look at the Neewers down there in the bottom right corner. You can see they're getting this incredible shift in color at the sides and the corners. The Nisi Pro, JJC, I mean, they're all pretty similar. None of these would really be ideal, but you might be able to use them in a pinch depending on sort of the situation or what's in the image. Now we zoom into 20 millimeters and 4 stops, and what I'm really trying to show you here is at 4 stops, this is right at the limit of where I consider it usable. So we've zoomed into 20 millimeters, we're at 4 stops, we're having a look at the comparison to the bare lens. 7 Artisans looks great, that's totally usable. Nisi Pro and JJC look pretty good. The Neewers have a little bit of color cast. I think the H&Y has a little bit more darkening. But honestly, I think you could get away with using any of these. The Neewers, that color cast in the corners isn't ideal, and that might show up depending on what you're shooting. Now we're zoomed into 24 millimeters. Once again, compare the bare lens. I mean, look at the 7 Artisans. That is actually a budget filter, and the cross-pattern performance on the 7 Artisans is just crazy good. The JJC, Nisi Pro, I think are both fine, but I mean, I think all of these are usable, but once again, you see those two Neewer, you get those color casts just creeping into the corners. Keep in mind, if you actually back these filters off to say 4 stops, they're all going to be pretty good, near perfect. So don't be too obsessed with this, but this is just giving you some sort of comparison. The filters that don't perform well, it just means that you have less usable stops at any given focal length. Now, we're looking at 35 millimeters 5 stop here, and what this demonstrates is now once we're at 35 millimeters, we can pretty much use any of these filters at their maximum 5 stops and D, and they're all perfectly usable. So the cross pattern performance, what that's going to change is at the wider focal lengths, you're going to be able to decrease more light with the ones that perform better than the ones that perform worse, but it's not like you still can't use the ones that have the worst performance, and some of those are the cheaper options. So depending on what you're doing, those might still be the right filters for you. Now, a lot of these systems are not only 1 to 5 stops, but they also have a 6 to 9 stop component of them. And I just wanted to show you how that was working. And if we look at the Neewer 1 to 9 and the K&F Nano 1 to 9, those are both filters that it's a single filter and they're trying to do a full 1 to 9 stops. And what you'll see the disadvantage of that is here at 24 millimeters and 8 stops, those are completely unusable. But when we compare that to the JJC True Color, which is a filter that has a clip-on magnetic front, which turns it from a 1 to 5 to a 6 to 10, and the 7 Artisans, which achieves this by having a completely separate filter for 6 to 9, comparing to the bare lens, those are completely usable. I think the JJC True Color is probably the best of them. But what you'll see is these cheaper 1 to 9 stop filters, and some of them aren't even that cheap. The K&F Nano X isn't actually that cheap. The 1 to 9 stop filter systems, you are going to get this issue. So even though they're 1 to 9 and it sounds great, they probably aren't usable for the full 1 to 9 range. And you almost have to think of them more like 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 stop filters anyways. I know there was a lot of information in those vignette tests, so just to give you my summarized conclusion, I thought for the vignette performance, the 7 Artisans was clearly the best. I was surprised at the performance of that filter. That is one of the more affordable filters in the range. It's a new release by 7 Artisans, and I think they've done a great job with it. Number 2, I'm putting the Nisi Pro, True Color Pro. This is kind of an industry standard, and almost every YouTuber either uses that or the Peter McKinnon variable ND, and the performance didn't disappoint. And then the JJC True Color I'm putting in 3rd, and that is an incredible performance for that filter. And of these top 3, it is the cheapest. It wasn't quite there where the Nisi Pro and 7 Artisans is, but I can tell you that is one of the most used filters around the studio here, and I was super impressed by the performance. Now, if you looked at both the Neewer filters, they didn't do as well, but that just means you don't have as many usable stops. It doesn't mean that they won't work for you. Because they are more affordable filters, I would not rule those out just now, particularly because the color performance on one of them was also very, very good. Looking at the sharpness and detailed performance on the lenses, I thought that these filters probably would have some impact on image detail. So we shot all 14 of them. We shot them at 50 millimeters on a 33 megapixel sensor. And I spent hours going back and forth between the different photos, zoomed into 400 or 500%. And honestly, every time I thought, is there a little bit of a difference? But I wasn't sure. And after spending all this time doing it, I said, okay, if I have to look this closely, then it's not relevant in any real world results. So I would say that there is either no impact or the impact on sharpness and detail is so little that it is not relevant. And so I've run the test. I would not worry about that at all. And I would not base your buying decision about any effect on sharpness and detail, because in real world results, they are all going to be indistinguishable from each other. Anytime you use a filter of any kind, you introduce the possibility of additional lens flare or glare affecting your image. And this is where a few of the filters really came undone, with the H&Y Revel Ring performing very poorly, as well as the JJC True Color. The K&F Nano K, which performed poorly on a number of other tests, performed very well. And the two standouts were the Freewell K2 system and the Nisi True Color system, two of the more expensive systems, but they really showed that your money does buy you a better flare performance. Now I'm going to go through price, and the prices went from $500 all the way down to $25, and just paying more didn't necessarily guarantee you a better optical performance. And I'll list on screen now the order, highest price to lowest price. One thing I will say is these prices do change. And in the past, when I've quoted prices, I've said this is a great filter, but it's a little bit more expensive than I think it should be. Then sometime later, they would discount the filter, and that video was sitting out there telling somebody that filter is not good value. And all of a sudden, it was great value. So because of that, check the links for the latest prices. But I'll just go through the ones that I think represented really good value. The Nisi Pro wasn't the most expensive in the entire list, and it is kind of an industry standard. So it is definitely more expensive than the cheaper options I'm going to recommend, but that's kind of like you buy that filter and use it for the rest of your life, and you're not going to have anything to worry about. The filter that was surprisingly close for the price was the 7 Artisans. That's about half the price of the Nisi. The other ones that stood out to me were the JJC Variable ND. That's like under $100 and is really an incredible filter. And then the Neewer Nano had excellent performance. The color cast was very, very close to the JJC. And I mean, it's way under $100. So that is a great budget filter. The other thing that you need to know that's going to affect the price of these filters is the size of the filter. So the more glass, the more expensive they are. Now, I have always got 82 millimeter filters, and then I have used step-up rings to allow me to use them on any size lens. That is a way to save money by only having one filter. But if you are not going to be ever using an 82, or you want to get a variable ND that works on, say, your 67 millimeter lens, because that's the main one you use, you will save money by using a 67 or buying a 67 rather than an 82. Also, the step-up rings are very inexpensive, so I do recommend that you get step-up rings to allow you to use those filters on lenses that have a smaller filter size. Now, I know that's a lot of information, so here are my conclusions. And I'm going to start with a couple of filter systems that might not be the right filter system for everyone, but for the right person, they might be the perfect system. And the first one is the Freewell matte box system. Now, if you don't need a matte box, and this is obviously not going to be of interest to you, but if you're somebody that does need a matte box and a variable ND filter system, you're getting excellent optical quality with this system. So you're getting a whole bunch of functionality that you aren't getting from a standard ND filter, and it's still not the most expensive system in the lineup. Now, the other filter system, which is the most expensive in the lineup, but has a number of functional advantages over every other filter system I've tested, is the Freewell K2. And this is a super versatile system. Now, it comes with a 1 to 5 and 6 to 9 stop in the package. So you've got 1 all the way to 9. In addition to that, it has the ability to be used just as a circular polarizing filter, and there's a range of additional magnetic filters that you can use with it, as well as you have the ability to use rectangular filters by opening these top and bottom flats. That allows you to use a gradient filter. So now you've got a filter system that is perfect for cinema, but it's also perfect for landscape. So it is a one and done, kind of does everything for you filter system, and the optical quality is excellent. But even though it is a more expensive filter system, you are getting a lot of functional advantages over a standard filter. The next one, it's a bit of an honorable mention, and I wish the optical performance was a little bit better, is this H&Y Revel Ring. Now, this allows you to put this filter on anything from a 67 all the way up to an 82 millimeter filter thread, and it's just got a spring-loaded system that kind of grabs on the front of your lens, and that stays on reasonably well. The disadvantage of it is it does have quite a color shift, but if you're doing photography like landscape photography, you can adjust in camera or you can shoot raw and deal with that later. So I do think if you're somebody that's using a variety of different lenses and you have a bunch of different filter sizes and you don't want to carry around step-up rings, I think this is also a good option. Now, one of my top budget recommendations is this JJC True Color system. Now, it comes with a carrying case. It also comes with a lens cap, which I don't have here on the table. But the real killer feature of this system is the fact that it is a 1:5 and a 6:9. And all you got to do is just remove this magnetic top, and that turns it into 1:5. You put this on and line it up properly, and now we are a 6:9. The disadvantage of this is the glare or flare performance isn't great, but the color accuracy is pretty good. The price is excellent. And just because of the ergonomics and the way this filter works, it is one of the most popular filters around the studio, and we use it all the time. Now, the next two I'm going to recommend are my #1 budget recommendations, as long as you don't need to go all the way up to 9 stops. And that is the Neewer Nano 1:5 and the 7 Artisans VND True Color 2:5. Now, when I originally did this testing, the Neewer was the cheaper filter, and the performance was good enough that I thought if you really were on a budget, you would go for the Neewer over the 7 Artisans, because the 7 Artisans was about twice the price. But since I've done all those tests, the price on the 7 Artisans has dropped, and it's now cheaper than the Neewer. So I put the links in the description down below. Check the pricing. If the 7 Artisans is cheaper or close, I would definitely go with that. The only disadvantage of the 7 Artisans is it is a 2 to 5 stop filter rather than a 1 to 5 stop filter. But for me, I would make that sacrifice just because the optical performance of the 7 Artisans is so good. It's actually not that far behind the Nisi True Color Pro. And my #1 recommendation, if you have the budget, is the Nisi True Color 1:5. You're going to get this nice little carrying pouch. You're going to get a filter that comes with a lens cap. Not all of them do. You're going to get a hard stop filter. You're also going to get a filter that does 1 to 5 stops. In addition to that, you're going to get the best flare or glare performance. You're going to get on par or thereabouts the best color performance. And you're going to get on par or thereabouts the best cross pattern performance. So when you look at a filter system that makes the least compromises, this is absolutely it. Now, an ND filter is not the only filter that you should have for your lenses, and I've just thrown a video on screen now. Some people think that using a protective or UV filter on your lenses will ruin the image quality. That is an absolute myth. In this video, I dispel that. I also explain why I use a protective filter on all of my lenses anytime I leave the house or studio.